Hello, I'm Anitra Thorhog, a member of the Club of Rome and the co-president of the USA Club of Rome. And today we're going to be discussing well-being. We have formed a discussion group to find the concept by which the well-being of the earth, its ecosystems, and its peoples could move forward. We have had several discussions already in 2021. First, by David Corton, who spoke to us about You Cannot Eat Money, which was a discussion on the failure of the economic system to create well-being and sustainability in the world, on the planet. Then we heard a very enlightening lecture by Dr. Mamphela Remphala about towards self-liberation, education, and learning. This was followed by Carlos Alvarez Pereira speaking to us about civilizations and how there is a need for redefining and moving forward with a new planetary civilization. Today we will hear two discussants, of whom Julia Kim, MD, is a program director of the Gross National Happiness Center in Bhutan. And that's a group which aims to promote the well-being economies based on human flourishing in balance with nature. Her education was in Canada and England, and then she was sent by UN agency to South Africa, followed by work in New York and Asia on health and development. She's been a senior policy advisor to the United Nations Development Program, to UNICEF in New York. She is a member of the Club of Rome. And she will be facilitated by an internationally recognized master facilitator, Charles Holmes. He is a convener who works with multi-stakeholder groups around the world addressing complex systems challenges. He's co-founder of the Academy for Systems Change and helped to establish the Dalai Lama Center for Peace and Education in Vancouver, Canada. His life passion is that he engages in comments and connectivity of individuals, teams, and communities to understand sustainability on the earth. So Julia Kim will introduce her subject matter, and we will discuss afterwards with the group of the discussant group the well-being potential of the earth, its ecosystems, and its peoples. Thank you.
Before I start, I would like to maybe ask all of us to take a moment just to turn down the noise of the outside world as we were invited to in that poem. And just if you're holding anything in your hands, just let it drop and be present on your seat. And just take a moment to feel your body on your chair. Connect to the sense that this chair is not floating in space, but is actually held by the earth. That we are all immediately in this moment connected to Mother Earth. And become aware for a moment of the space above your head, beyond the ceiling, beyond the building, and up into the sky, up into the vastness of space. And between the support of the earth and the vastness of space, we are sitting in our bodies, and in the middle point, connecting, is our hearts. And I invite you to just take a moment to connect to your heart and to your breath. Thank you. So thank you, Anitra and Ted and David for inviting me to follow a very illustrious group of speakers. I have to say I was both intimidated and excited at the prospect. I want to start by really just talking a little bit about how I became interested in working in this field of well-being economics and happiness. It definitely was not a thought through career trajectory at all. Maybe to say a little bit about my own starts. Actually born in Canada, trained as a medical doctor, and very early on became interested in what beyond the medical skills could I contribute into the world. After my training in the United States, I had the opportunity to go as a UN volunteer doctor to South Africa, where I was working in some of the poorest communities, the ex-homelands, they euphemistically called it, in Limpopo province, South Africa. It was my first contact as someone who'd grown up in the middle income, middle class context in a wealthy country, my first contact with poverty. And it was a bit of a shock. And in the middle of the AIDS pandemic, was very daunted by the fact that the tools I'd learned in medical school didn't seem to be very effective. At the same time that I was working there, I had the opportunity to contact the enormous generosity. I was doing HIV surveys, going home to home in villages. And after finding out that there was not enough food to feed the children, when I asked the head of the house, they would often invite me for a cup of tea and some bread after I'd done my interview, which absolutely floored me, the generosity that I was experiencing. At the same time, I was teaching nurses, primary healthcare nurses in South Africa about HIV counseling and testing. And after our sessions, there would be a celebration, a braai, a dance, and such joy that I was, again, there was something about material poverty and the lack of spiritual poverty that I was experiencing at that time that made me ask lots of questions about what is development and how is it connected to happiness and well-being. This was reinforced when I went back and forth to London, where I was getting my Master's of Public Health at the London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine. And I'd end up in a scenario like this on the tube, where often I would be still bubbling with the energy of South Africa. And when I would talk to my neighbor and say, ask what's going on, would be greeted with this kind of look as if to ask, are you crazy? What medications are you on? Again, sort of making me question, what is it about development and community that might be getting lost? Around that time, I was invited to join UNDP in New York. And as I was making the leap over, I had this intuition that somehow there was a part of me that was not quite ready, that there was some work I needed to do on my own ego in order to be able to work in these very powerful institutions and with institutional egos. And as luck would have it, I had the opportunity to enter a traditional 3-year meditation retreat and to move back and forth between New York and the UN and time in retreat. And it was around this time, as my questions about development and what we were promoting as developed countries onto developing countries, that I had the chance to meet the first Prime Minister of Bhutan, who was speaking about GNH. And the contrast between what I was experiencing with my friends and colleagues in Manhattan, I think I was spending more money and making more money than I'd ever done in my life. I was more in debt than I'd ever been. And like many of my friends, felt more pressure and more impoverished than in other parts of my life. So when the opportunity came to work at the GNH Center, I without hesitation, felt this was a new paradigm, a new way of looking at development that I had to understand more deeply. And I ended up spending the next 8 years of my life in Bhutan, and that's where my story begins. I wanted to start by sharing some resonance that came up as I was reviewing our previous speakers and with great thanks for the slides and the talks that they shared. David spoke about the fact that we are dealing with a deep system failure and that marginal changes are just not going to get us out of here. We really require a transformation in our understanding of the nature and purpose of life and what it means to be human if we are to create an ecological civilization. Mampela then spoke about how do we tap into deep spirit and wisdom and bring this to African leaders and others, and how can we bring the LEAP principles of education and tools into leadership. So again, now resonating with John Gilmore's work. We then had the wonderful presentation from Carlos, where he asked this very profound question: how do we reconcile the way we think with how life actually works? How do we create a pluriversal synthesis of ancient wisdom and the best of modern science? So now picking up the thread that Mampela had given us. Following that, I read a paper that David sent my way in response to some of the thoughts that Mampela had introduced, where he talks about ubuntu, I am because you are. So if we acknowledge that all things are interdependent, from that wisdom, we would have insight into the difference between egonomics and what he's calling an ecological economics. And he mentioned an Ubuntu principle: my well-being depends on your well-being, and I do best when we all do well. And then I picked up also on a comment from Didi: how can we design the storytelling of impact using cold and warm data so that it has a ripple effect in a culturally adaptable, pluriversal way, such that we inspire collaborative action in building well-being economies? So Didi was really looping back to this wonderful presentation that Nora Bateson gave us earlier in the year. So it's with that as a kind of field of resonance that I want to share some of my thoughts. So really my intentions for this session are to share some of the emerging lessons from Bhutan based on a systems perspective. I want to dive into well-being economies from the point of view of both inner transformation and systems change. Why are both of these important? I will talk a little bit about awareness-based systems change as a way of cultivating our capacity to deeply sense both self and system, and therefore co-create an emerging future. And then we'll have time to reflect how might these inform and shape our own Club of Rome thinking and engagement going forward. So this is a metaphor that will be familiar to many of us, the iceberg. We know that maybe 1/7 of it is above the surface and the majority lies below. And if we think about the world we live in, what is above the surface, the visible behaviors, the symptoms, what basically grabs the news headlines, does not reflect what is underneath that, the structures and systems that have got us there. But even further below that, the paradigms of thought, our narratives, our mental models that then shape those structures and systems. And then there's even a further layer beneath the paradigms of thought, which is our sources of inspiration. What are our visions, our values, and mindsets? And I want to bring in some of the words of one of our important founding leaders and thinkers, Donella Meadows, when she pointed out that because mindsets and paradigms guide our behaviors, they can have a profound impact. And that if we can intervene at the level of paradigm, we can hit a leverage point that can totally transform systems. So Otto Scharmer, who has been a leading thinker in some of this systems change work, has really talked about a way of looking at the multiple crises we're seeing right now in terms of 3 defining disconnects. The ecological disconnect, which is our disconnect from self and nature, which we see all around us in the environmental devastation that we are inflicting upon this planet. A social disconnect, which is getting louder and louder, whether we talk about the rising inequalities that we're seeing in the world, or else we're talking about the xenophobia and fear and racism. But what's often not spoken about is the disconnect that can be thought of as a disconnect between ourselves and our highest potential, our highest selves, which he speaks of as a spiritual disconnect. So in this context, the story of GNH really begins at the deepest level with a visionary king. This is the fourth king of Bhutan, who in the 1970s, when asked by a reporter, what is the gross national product of Bhutan, instead of giving a number, replied with a statement that gross national happiness is more important than gross national product, thereby coining the phrase that would now determine the way that Bhutan is developing into the future. It's interesting that around that same time in 1968, Robert Kennedy gave the famous speech, which really critiqued gross national product, that it measures everything in life except that which makes it worthwhile. Interesting that this timing also coincides with the release of the report, Limits to Growth. So clearly a shift in paradigm thinking happening at multiple points around the globe. One of the challenges of speaking about GNH is that many people have this very limited idea of what happiness is. It's often associated with the smiley faces and feeling good, fleeting moments of feeling good. But I love this definition from the first Prime Minister, which is very profound and speaks to what GNH really is about. And he said, true abiding happiness cannot exist while others suffer and comes only from serving others, living in harmony with nature and realizing our innate wisdom. So as you listen to those words, you'll see that it's really about a relational kind of happiness. It's about healing these three disconnects that I mentioned earlier, the disconnect from self through wisdom, disconnect from others, because we can't actually be happy if others are harmed. And it comes from serving others, and our deep connection to nature. It reflects also the Ubuntu principle, and it immediately counters this myth of Homo economicus. Here, happiness is not a competition, and well-being is not a zero-sum equation. My well-being does not take away from your well-being. There is not a limited amount to go around. So in Bhutan, I think one of the unique contributions of GNH, which is different from many economic theories, even well-being economic propositions, is that it really highlights the importance of both inner and outer transformation. So when we talk about outer transformation, you can think about the GNH survey as creating an enabling environment for well-being by measuring 9 domains, which have 33 indicators, and you see them on the slides here. They include things like living standards and education and health, which are kind of building blocks for well-being, but also a lot of the more intangible characteristics that get missed on a lot of surveys, but are known to be really important for a sense of well-being. For example, time use, community vitality, cultural diversity, and resilience. These 9 domains are seen as interdependent rather than in a hierarchy or competing with one another. So this can all seem rather abstract and theoretical. So I would like to take us through a little activity that will give you a taste of these 9 domains. It's one that we often do with groups where we've adapted the 9 domains. It's not the GNH survey, but we've adapted them to different organizations and business contexts so people get a sense of it. So this would be a time to grab that paper and pen that Charles mentioned. And it's really about looking at the 9 domains of GNH in your own life. And we'll use a very simple scale where 0 is very poor and 10 is excellent. And you can just list the domain and score yourself, whatever comes to mind. Don't give it too much thought. So the first domain is health. My lifestyle supports good physical and mental health. Just take a moment to reflect on that in your own life right now and give yourself a score, 0 to 10. Second domain is living standards. I feel confident I have enough financial security to meet my needs and those of my family. I feel confident I have enough financial security to meet my needs and those of my family. Third domain, education. I have enough learning opportunities to meet the shifting challenges in my professional career. Number 4, environment. In my workplace, there is high awareness and responsibility towards the environment. give yourself a score, 0 to 10. Fifth domain, community vitality. When I faced a personal crisis, I felt I had enough support from my friends and family. So we know that community vitality is really essential for our sense of well-being, above and beyond GDP. Sixth domain, time use. I have enough time to do the things I enjoy with friends and family. This one is critical to our sense of well-being and has been declining in many high GDP countries. Number 7, psychological well-being. I feel there's good alignment between my sense of life purpose and my work. So this is a question we often ask when we're doing this kind of GNH survey in a business or in our organization. And this sense of purpose and meaning is really important to a sense of well-being. Okay. Domain 8, good governance. In my country, I feel that there's a good level of transparency and trust in leadership. And when we do this exercise with people in multiple countries, it's really revealing what comes out here. So take a moment to just give yourself a score based on the country where you are based or identify with right now. And finally, cultural diversity and resilience. Where I live, cultural diversity is seen as a positive contribution to society. And you can score that. So taken together, you can see that if you were to connect the dots as in that diagram there in that wheel, it's not even. And it's often very revealing to people of how these different domains are connected to creating a well-being in an organization or a society. So we'll have a chance to reflect on this a little bit more when we move into our breakouts, but just to give you a sense of the 9 domains in Bhutan. It's important that the idea of sufficiency, enoughness, is built into the GNH framework. In the survey, there's a set point, a sufficiency threshold for each of the 9 domains, statistically set, which determines whether for that domain somebody would be considered happy or not. So it's not about getting 100% in all the 9 domains. It's also possible that 6 out of 9 domains can be seen as meeting that sufficiency threshold, and that person would be considered to be happy. So again, that allows for individual variation between which domains are important. And again, it's looking at how do we balance out between these 9 different domains. So if that's about the outer transformation, the system, the enabling environment, in Bhutan, the inner transformation is also a big part of the story of GNH, transforming the mindsets, cultivating capacities. And it begins, as I said, with the vision of questioning what is the purpose of the economy and going beyond chasing GDP growth to promoting equity, sustainability, and well-being. In Bhutan, meditation and GNH values are very much a part of the culture, the education system. It's really about cultivating awareness and insight into the interconnectedness of all life, nourishing altruistic behaviors that are rooted in compassion and generosity from the earliest ages. The 5th king of Bhutan, our current king, speaks of leadership of the self, asking people, are you leading lives guided by these values of kindness, integrity, and justice? And this has really led to a strong sense of community and a culture of volunteerism. You know, the director of the GNH Center in Bhutan, my colleague, is a Desut, which translates into guardian of peace. It's a network of volunteers in Bhutan who are called at any time to help out with issues with emergencies, natural disasters. And they've been especially visible during the COVID pandemic, this culture of volunteerism and community. the world is sitting up and taking attention. I don't know if people saw that the front page of the Washington Post carried a story about Bhutan yesterday. It's remarkably had only one COVID death. And from the very beginnings, even though it was not the wealthiest country and there were shortages of masks, civil society mobilized to sew masks and to get them out to rural areas. When people had to be quarantined, farmers donated food so people would not have to worry about that. And in the past 2 weeks, they've managed to vaccinate 93% of their eligible adults. This really began with an amazing combination of the best of modern science and that ancient wisdom that Carlos was referencing. They actually had enough vaccines to start 2 weeks ago, but they consulted their spiritual leaders and astrologers who felt that a more auspicious time would be to start in the beginning of this month and to begin with a 30-year-old woman, and that the vaccine should also be given by a 30-year-old woman born in the year of the monkey. And so not starting by age, not starting with the eldest. And actually, the king has said that he wants to be the last to be vaccinated. He wants to wait until everybody is vaccinated. So a remarkable way of bringing those two together, and a real example of that kind of servant leadership that I mentioned earlier. How many of our heads of state would have made the same move? So how does this get operationalized? I mentioned the vision, the purpose of the economy set by Bhutan's kings. You need practical measurements to know if you're getting to that vision. So the GNH survey, which is undertaken every 3 years by the Center for Bhutan Studies and GNH Research. It's also not enough just to have measures if you don't put them into action. And the GNH commission, the planning commission, uses a screening tool based on those 9 domains to screen policies. If they're going to put up a dam, if they were going to mine, what will be the impact on those 9 domains? And a policy is sent back and asked to improve certain domains that are scoring low before it's accepted. It's also informing their 5-year development plans. And then finally, all this could be very theoretical and top down if it were not permeating into civil society. And so my organization, the GNH Center, is really about bringing it into daily life through leadership programs, business, education, civil society, and increasingly engaging with the international world. So if you see all of those together, it's really about getting below that surface, the iceberg I mentioned earlier, the vision and values shaping the structures and systems, and then shaping the community, the culture, and society. How does this show up in Bhutan, in the policies and practices? If you were to land in Bhutan, you would not see billboard advertising. There's a national ban on this, and the beauty of the country really stands out in stark contrast. They've really prioritized caring for people. That means universal free basic health and education. And the current prime minister just made teachers and healthcare workers the highest paid civil servants in the country, highlighting that this is a priority. Most people know that Bhutan is the first and only carbon negative country in the world and a biodiversity hotspot. They have pledged in their constitution to maintain for all time at least 60% of the country under forest cover. And you may wonder, how is this possible in this country that is bordered by India and China? And I think a central aspect is that in Bhutan, nature is considered sacred. In 1994, they decided to allow mountaineering up to an altitude of 6,000 meters. And there was consideration that in Bhutan, the mountains are considered the abode of sacred spirits, of deities, and that it's inappropriate to be climbing on top of them with boots. And even though it was a lucrative form of income to the country, in 2003, mountaineering was banned entirely in the country, leaving Bhutan with some of the highest unscaled peaks in the world. This is also reflected in their high value, low impact tourism, where they're really balancing tourist income with the social and environmental impacts. And as I mentioned earlier, the National Education Program is bringing in a secular form of meditation and GNH values throughout the country. This isn't to say that Bhutan is without challenges, and the latest survey data showed that farmers were actually less happy than other occupations. Interestingly, women were less happy than men, and Bhutanese youth for the first time were the age group that was the least happy. So in a survey like this should provoke questions to policymakers and to government. And they are now looking at how do we improve the rural infrastructure, bringing in electricity and roads to the most isolated areas. There are initiatives to improve women's empowerment and political participation. There are efforts to tackle the growing youth unemployment and the growing exposure to social media and to globalization, and bringing in civil society and business more and more and promoting GNH. So one of the things that always strikes me about Bhutan is, in spite of the international attention, there's a great deal of self-reflection and humbleness, especially among the leaders about GNH. I love this quote again from the first Prime Minister of Bhutan, when he says that Bhutan's not a country that has attained GNH. Like most developing countries, we are still struggling to meet the basic needs of people. But what separates us from most other countries is that we've made happiness the foundation of human needs as a goal of social change. So really seeing GNH as a constant journey rather than a destination. And I want to leave us with a quote from one of the ministers of Bhutan, really drawing attention to the interdependence of Bhutan with the rest of the world, when he says that we cannot be a GNH bubble in a GDP world, that this movement towards a well-being economy needs to be spread beyond the borders of the Himalayas. So I'd like to pause now and maybe allow us a chance to sort of sit with some of the images and ideas that have resonated with us, and hand over to Charles.
We're going to do something a little different. I'm sure there are many questions that folks have that you'd like to pose to Julia, but instead we're going to invite you, as she indicated, into a conversation with one or two other colleagues. We're going to use the breakout room function of Zoom for about 8 minutes. And the invitation is, what struck you? What did you hear that evoked insights, ideas, curiosity? And there may also be a question. We'd encourage you to stay away from, going straight to, well, what about this? What about going straight to the questions, but to reflect on even back to the definition of happiness, and as well, perhaps even some reflections on on your own response to the GNH index and the questions that she took us through. Welcome back, everyone. I'm presuming most of you have had the experience. I'm just going to do a mute here. Have had the experience of being in Zoom rooms before, and if not, I hope it was an informative and interesting one. What we're going to do next, Julia is going to take us into some more deeper content around the economies and economics of well-being, focusing on Bhutan. But before we do, we'd just be really curious to hear not so much questions of Julia, because we are going to have a time for some Q&A, but we'd love to hear one or two comments about something that was evoked or that struck you in your conversation with one or two of your colleagues. And because I've muted everyone, you'll just need to unmute yourself. And if you unmute yourself, I'll see that as an indication that you want to share something briefly. And again, we'll hear maybe two or three comments, and then Julia will share some more. David.
Yeah, that the poor possess something terribly important that the rich do not possess.
Thanks, David. Herbie.
Yeah, we were talking about the fact that obviously not many people wanted that much from Bhutan in terms of resources. I don't hear anything about minerals or even timber from Bhutan. So I think in some ways the splendid isolation that Bhutan was in, I think probably contributed to the current situation. That then, of course, that in combination with what seemed to be wise leaders, of course, that's a very happy combination. But if there were lithium or cobalt in the mountains of Bhutan, maybe you would already be in a different situation.
Power is in the leadership versus the extraction of power-related material. We'll hear a little more about that from Julia. Thanks, Herbie. Ted. and then Marilyn, and
Just
then
one,
Anitra.
just one short comment. We all wondered how people are kept in order and do the youth leave?
Great. Thanks to the youth lead, and how is order maintained? Marilyn, was your unmuting a request to
Yes.
share a comment? Thank you.
And we talked about, and I would love to hear more from Julia about the changing political structure in Bhutan and how you continue to have happiness as your overarching, thought. And also the addition of social media and what happens with the new generation of children who've now been exposed to things that before that were not available.
Beautiful. That was happiness still centered in a shifting political structure and social media. Anitra and then Carlos.
Yeah, I think John should try to sum up whatever the hell it was that was being said in our room between three very interesting people. But my own question is, when does the integration and how does the integration happen between the outer reality and transformation and the inner reality and transformation? That seems to me critical, and I don't know how the process goes.
Beautiful. Thank you.
In my
Anitra.
sum up, I would just say, where do we sign up, Julia? How do we join? And if it's a cult, we're quite happy.
Thanks, John.
That's the summary.
That's the summary.
There's something here we want to be a part of. That's great. Carlos.
Yeah, I was struck by this quote of GNH is a journey, not a destination. I think this points to the critical factor of culture and the understanding of life as a journey. And then the most important is not to define goals and indicators and all that. It's the way we walk together. And that points to a deep wisdom. Probably it's also related to Asia in general, to the consideration that everything is dynamic, everything flows, it's not static. And so in my view, what I got is a lot of what could explain this success story is actually implicit, not so explicit, and it's culture, and it's cultural rootedness, as Herbie mentioned in our breakout session. And we should, I think we should look at that in looking for inspiration for other places.
Carlos, you evoke for me the name, I think, of this group, a merry band of voyageurs, and the question, how are you walking together?
Yeah.
How are you proceeding on this journey together? So, and I'll put it out there as a little bit of a challenge. What is it about what Julia has shared and is now going to share more of that can inform the way you walk together in this group, and maybe more broadly the Club of Rome? I'm not sure, but it's beautiful. I loved the journey reminds me of the way we walked, the importance of being aware of the way we walk together. Mm-hmm. So Julia's going to take us a little bit deeper, and I know, having sat with her in some of this presentation, that some of the questions that you've raised will be woven into some of what's next. But when she finishes, we'll then just sort of open it up to a general further questions for Julia to respond directly to. Julia.
Thank you, Charles. And thank you so much for the comments and questions you shared. I hope some of it will be deepened and perhaps some of them answered as we go into the next part of my presentation. So again, I'm going to just put some slides up. So I want to begin really with this question that Anitra asked about how do we bring the inner and the outer together, both in the context of Bhutan and also thinking about well-being economies in general. Some of you mentioned how do we sign up, or how do we get some of that experience either by visiting Bhutan or seeing how it might reflect on our own cultures, the importance of culture. So this next part will be examining some of those questions and looking at what happens if we look at well-being economies as a whole. What could we learn from Bhutan and what I shared? So again, starting with the importance of inner and outer transformation, I want us to think about why do we need a shift in consciousness, not just talking about Bhutan, but in our countries, in our developed, so-called developed countries. What exactly are we up against? You know, why has a shift of consciousness not happened yet? And the importance of reclaiming our attention. And I want to introduce this idea of awareness-based systems change. So I want to begin with a quote from David during his talk to us, which really caught my attention. And David said, our cultural map is flawed and yet reinforced by media and other forces, as if our goal were to dehumanize ourselves and separate ourselves from each other and nature. So we're not operating in a neutral space when we talk about moving into well-being economies from where we are now. Back in 1984, Pierre Bourdieu commented that class status is gained, lost, and reproduced through our everyday acts of consumer behavior. In fact, our consumption practices maintain a basic structure of power and inequality which now characterize our world. We consume for status and affirmation. It's not just about buying products for their own sake. And this quote from Adam Lerner in a very interesting piece that he wrote, in a society where consumption has become one of the only ways for the individual to exercise power, we consume as an aspirational response. And that's a heartbreaking sentence just to say out loud, but really, what does it mean when to exercise power in our society now, we consume? And it's not a surprise then that breaking our consumption habits is proving extremely difficult, even in the face of what we know are their impacts on the environment. The painful irony of all of this is that in spite of all this increased income and consumption, there's actually been little to no benefit on our overall sense of well-being, while simultaneously we're devastating our planet. So the question it raises for me is, how can we go beyond individual voluntary simplicity, what some of us might try and wish to do, to actually tackling the deeper politics of consumption? What is the shift in consciousness and the systems change levers that would be required to do that? There's some really interesting science coming out now around our mindsets and our inner state and our sense of well-being. And this is a great paper. The title is A Distracted Mind is an Unhappy Mind, published in Science. And a group of Harvard researchers actually used a smartphone to track people and to ask them at various times, how happy are you? What are you currently doing? And were you actually thinking about your current activity or about something else? So they would get this message and have to respond to these questions. What they found was a little bit shocking. On average, an adult spends almost half of their waking hours thinking about something other than what they're doing. And this mind wandering typically makes them feel unhappy. Their conclusion was that mind wandering is an excellent predictor of unhappiness. In fact, it's actually a better predictor than the actual activity that we're engaged in. So it's not so much about whether you're washing the dishes or you're having a dinner with somebody that you really care about. It's really about how present are you when that's happening. And I think, you know, I'd invite all of us to just reflect on moments when we have actually noticed that. We could be doing the most mundane thing, mowing the lawn. And there's a sense, how do we connect that sense of presence? Or we could be having a dinner, like in the top photo there, with somebody we really love and notice that they're absolutely not present. How does that make us feel? What's of concern is that latest research is showing that in the US, children age 8 to 18 now spend more than 7 hours a day gazing at their screens. What is this telling us about the state of our minds and our capacity to move into a well-being economy? So I want to really look more deeply into the idea of the inner transformation for well-being economies in our countries. Why shifting values, mindsets, and consciousness matters. I think we really need to look at how do we decolonize our minds from our addiction to consumerism and the distorted mindsets and habitual behaviors that have been created by decades of neoliberal economics. We need to reclaim our attention and detox from the constant barrage of distraction and actual outright manipulation through advertising, social media, to actually be masters rather than puppets of our expanding technology. It's not that technology itself is bad, it's whether we are actually masterfully using it. It's also about cultivating our highest human potential. This cannot happen in a vacuum. The values that we've referenced before, ubuntu. In Bhutan, it would be the bodhisattva, the peaceful warrior who delays his own enlightenment in order to benefit others. In our indigenous cultures, we speak about seventh generation thinking, planning ahead, acting as if we were planning for the seventh generation. Ego to eco consciousness in more modern terms. All of them point to expanding our sense of self and seeing ourselves as part of a whole. This is central for us to be moving into well-being economics. We need to strengthen our capacity to expand our time horizons while taking action now. That means letting go of our attachment to outcomes and really, which doesn't mean giving up. Back in the time when I was working at the UN, a big source of my possible burnout was the fact that I was working but never knowing if my actions of that day, of that year, would actually have any impact on things like climate change. So it's also critical for taking care of ourselves and not burning out. This ability to expand our time horizons while taking action now, that can be cultivated. And finally, we need to generate the courage, the imagination, and the will to step into an unknown, emergent future rather than making incremental cosmetic changes or actually propping up failing systems. So all these point to an inner transformation. It's fascinating that we're now in a time where, reflecting back on Carlos's question about combining ancient wisdom and modern science, we are seeing those come together in terms of how we reclaim our attention. For those who are familiar with the neuroscience of meditation, a lot of fascinating studies are looking at neuroplasticity, the capacity of our brain to be shaped by experience. And in this case, contemplation, practices on compassion, it actually shapes the way that the neurons are wiring and firing together in the brain and last beyond the actual time that people are practicing to influence their behaviors in the world. Meta-awareness, or a kind of meditative awareness, is the ability to be aware of what we're doing. It's trainable and it brings a range of health and well-being benefits. Our ability to cope with stress and to have greater resilience. In other words, our ability to sustain positive emotions and rebound from negative emotions. Many of us are in traumatic situations or experience difficult situations, but how we respond to that, our resilience can be shaped. Enhanced compassion, altruism, and pro-social behaviors can also be cultivated. An excellent book on the science of meditation by Goldman and Davidson, and the report on the global happiness and well-being reports, and some of the chapters by Halliwell and Daner also point to this. So Dr. Richard Davidson, who's been heading up a lot of this neuroscience research at the Center for Healthy Minds, has said, in the same way that we became aware that a physical body needs exercise and can actually be trained, cardiovascularly trained for long distance running, for weightlifting, and so forth, we now know how meditation can also have these different and specific effects on our well-being and on our minds. And that exercising our bodies should be, exercising our minds should be approached much in the same way as we exercise our bodies. So big implications for education, for how we think about communities, how we think about business. And the Davidson's group has put together the Healthy Minds program based on this neuroscience that really looks at 4 pillars of well-being: awareness, our ability to be present; connection, appreciation, kindness, compassion; insight into how our minds work, to be aware of the narratives we tell ourselves; and purpose, understanding our values, our principles, and really our ability to maintain our motivation amidst challenges. So this is more and more coming into business, into education programs around the world. So I want to talk now a little bit about awareness-based systems change. Having talked about the importance of the inner transformation, how do we bring this into the outer work, into the activity, the projects, the systems change? And really reflecting back to Mampella's question, how do we tap into our deep spirit and wisdom and bring this to leaders and others? So when we speak of awareness-based systems change, it's cultivating awareness and building leadership capacities to address the root causes of our complex social, environment, and spiritual crises. It's about supporting the shift in consciousness from ego to ecosystem awareness, so that in the context of well-being economies, it's not a question of what do I have to lose, but what do we all stand to gain by transitioning to a well-being economy? And in the doing, in the bringing it into action, I've had the fortune to be involved in a few well-being economy action learning labs where we're really trying to prototype to give birth to something that is emergent using these principles of awareness-based systems change. One of them is the Right Livelihood and GNH program, which initiated as a partnership between Schumacher College and the GNH Center in Bhutan. For the first time this year, we've started the program in Canada as a partnership between Canada and Bhutan. And it's really about adapting GNH values, practices, and metrics to one's own community, organization, or context. So taking it out of that Bhutan box and trying it out in new contexts. The Global Wellbeing Lab, which was hosted with the Presencing Institute and the Global Leadership Academy from GIZ in Germany, where we brought together leaders from government, business, and civil society to go through a process that, like I've described, looking at awareness-based systems change for a well-being economy. And just last week, I was invited to join the UN SDG Leadership Lab, which the Presencing Institute has been putting together with the UN, working with 14 UN country teams to really bring this kind of inner and outer awareness together. And the Presencing Institute has looking at how we can bring these kinds of processes to scale, global to local and local to global community building. Gaia is one program, U-School is another, for building movements around this kind of awareness-based systems change. What does that mean in terms of working with leaders? And Otto Scharmer has spoken about the blind spot of leadership, that mostly leaders are trained to look outwardly, to really look at the outer environment and how they can intervene. Whereas Otto has spoken in his book, Presencing, the success of our actions as change makers doesn't depend so much on what we do or how we do it, but rather on the inner place from which we operate. So really turning our attention within, looking at the galaxy within rather than outside, because we can't transform the behavior of systems unless we transform the quality of attention that people apply to their actions within those systems, both individually and collectively. So what that means in terms of turning the attention within, many of the practices that we are doing with leaders look at 4 different levels of listening, which are really levels of paying attention, of sensing. Most of us operate from the level of downloading, which is really about habits of judgment, where we're listening in to somebody's opinion to see if we actually agree with them or not. Old opinions and judgments are downloaded, and we either confirm them or we dismiss the other person's opinions. A deeper level of listening is factual listening, where we really cultivate the ability to open our minds and we notice differences. We listen for new data, what's disconfirming data, and hold that in our consciousness. We have the ability to hear something new. A deeper level of listening could be described as empathic listening, where we actually have an emotional connection to what we're experiencing, to the person we're talking to. And we actually have the experience of seeing through another person's eyes. Many of us have experienced that with somebody that we're close to, that we're in personal relationship with. But can we bring that into a work environment, into an organizational context? And that is a skill as well. It's cultivating the capacity to have an open heart. And the fourth level of listening, which is a little bit more difficult to describe, but many of us may have had experiences of it, is generative listening, where we're actually listening for the future that's wanting to emerge. It's really stepping out of our sense of self and identity, and for a moment, almost hovering above a situation. And in circumstances like that, often an idea or an inspiration will come that was not actually held by you or anyone in the group, but seems to emerge from the whole. And that skill is about cultivating the open will to let something new emerge. Many people who work in the creative fields, improvisers, musicians, are tapping into that generative listening all the time. Similarly, people who are master sportsmen in team sports are often playing from that generative listening. They aren't focusing so much on their own moves, but they know what's happening on the whole soccer field. So when that instant arises, they know exactly where to put the ball. So I want to come back to this question that Ndidi put into her description of what she's interested in with this group of well-being voyageurs, which is how can we design the storytelling of impact using cold and warm data so it has a ripple effect to inspire collaborative action in building well-being economies. And I have, with deep appreciation for Nora Bateson's work on warm and cold data, really the idea of cold data, just to refresh our minds and bring us back to her talk, is really the objective data, separation of subject and object, measuring visible forms. It's often decontextualized. It's important, it's useful information, but it's not nested in the context. It could be thought of as standing on the edge of a river and looking at the river. You might think of it as being influenced by Newtonian science. Warm data, on the other hand, is immersing in relational processes, dynamic networks, complex systems. It's deeply contextual. It's feeling the relationships. It would be stepping off the shore and getting your feet wet and getting into the river, feeling the flow of the water around you. And you might think of it as being nourished and influenced by complexity science. And in my work lately with a colleague, Julie Richardson, thinking about our work on GNH, we've been now starting to toy a little bit, play with the idea of something that we're calling hot data. And here we think about it as cultivating the capacity for awareness of these relational processes and a more conscious interaction to actually notice and shape what's emergent. This would be, for example, now stepping into the canoe or the kayak and being able to sense what's around in the water, the flow, but also be able to guide yourself to move down the stream, to know when is the time to stop, when is the time to release and go with the flow, when is the time to steer. And you can think about hot data as being influenced by the contemplative sciences and traditions. So if we were to look at GNH from the perspective of cold, warm, and hot data, you could think about the GNH index and the surveys as a kind of cold data. It's objective, it's survey data, it's definitely useful. And then the kind of work we're doing, we did now with our group about adapting the GNH measures to a particular business or organization with new actors, you could think of as warm data, new approaches about relationship of the data to that group. And an example of hot data would be that while adapting, we're helping people to cultivate awareness, to shift mindsets and ultimately behaviors and actions through programs like the Right Livelihood and GNH program that I mentioned. So working with cold data could be thought of as measuring the past, something that's already formed in order to predict the future. Whereas working relationally with warm data and with awareness with hot data is about co-creating the future as it emerges. So a little bit about the Right Livelihood program that I mentioned. We recently conducted some interviews with some of the participants who went through the program to try and find out what was going on for them on the inside and on the outside. And some of the inner shifts, some quotes from our participants, were about finding the calm inside myself and the courage of stepping out into action. Or as one participant put it, practicing boldness, realizing that to change is to become more aware of who we are. And in terms of some of the outer shifts, the activities, the prototypes that have been coming out of this program, one woman in the UK initiated a project of silent spaces, creating places of meditative silence in busy city gardens across the UK, recognizing how people were longing for that in the midst of busy cities. Another American teacher was bringing GNH principles into a horticultural apprenticeship program. An engineer in Thailand, a professor there, redesigning her engineering curriculum to focus on sustainable technologies and bringing in these interventions, bringing in reflexive pedagogies. And a Hong Kong business leader hosting an Asian venture philanthropy event, looking at well-being economies and sustainable finance initiatives in Hong Kong. So again, the leading from the inside to the outside. And I want to close with this quote from Andreas Weber about the importance of rediscovering the links between inner experience and the outer world. And I think it's important to say it's rediscovering. Most of what I've said in this session is actually not new. It's been suppressed or buried under many, many layers of development, of modern thinking, and of disconnect. And as Andreas says, in thinking about the Anthropocene and where we are now as human beings, it's really important for us to connect to this idea of a good life, of a happy life, and that the goal of leading a fuller life is perhaps the most important stepping stone forward for changing our relationships with the animate earth and among ourselves. And if we adopt this perspective, we'll begin to see that something is sustainable if it enables more life for myself, for other humans, and for the ecosystem on a broader cultural level. It's crucial to rediscover the linkage between our inner experience and the external natural order. So just to bring us back to where we started, the emerging lessons from GNH in Bhutan based on a systems thinking perspective, Wellbeing Economies, the importance of inner transformation as well as the outer systems change, why it's critical now, and how it is really about bringing ancient wisdom and science-based tools and capacities together as we think about systems change. And awareness-based systems change is really being cultivating the capacity to sense ourself and the system, and therefore co-create an emerging future. And my reference to cold data, warm data, and hot data. So really, I would be very grateful and interested for whatever this has brought up for us in our group of voyageurs, any insights into how it might inform our own thinking as a Club of Rome community, maybe how it might connect to some of the intentions around our 4 impact hubs. And just to say that myself and Julie Richardson, who I really want to thank for her support in thinking through some of these concepts, we're very open to further engagement and to developing these ideas further. So I think I'll stop there, and we can open it up now to more questions and more discussion.
Thank you so much, Julia. So I think we're getting applauses around the room. We were going to go into breakouts, but made the decision when you were in your first breakout, just given the time. And we wanted, Julia and I want to take about 10 minutes at the end to have a bit of a different kind of closure after we hear some reflections from David and Ted, who we've asked to kind of make some closing comments, which gives us about 10 minutes together right now to share either what struck you, or to respond to the questions that Julia has posed, or to ask her questions that are on your mind as a result of what she's just shared. John Gilmore for a question or a reflection, and then Ted, I assume your clapping hand is a hand raise, or
one or the other. I'm just trying to figure out how to use it, but yes, I will say something.
Okay, so let's go with John first, and then Herbie, and then Ted. John.
Well, firstly, just thank you for a huge gift, really, of an integrated way of looking at alternatives to the current paradigm. And I think that's a very difficult thing to create from nothing. You know, as we think we know what we want to break out of, what is it we go to? And this just represents a set of experiences and ideas that are fully integrated. Of course, there's much more to come, and of course, there's much more development to go, but it's a beautiful, it allows for a beautiful reimagining. And so thank you for that gift. However, just looking back at my own life is as a teacher, trying to break the shackles of the oppression of education rather than the liberation of education. And I'm taken back to Paulo Freire, the South American educator who was thrown out of his own country for his thinking about process, the process of liberation rather than the kind of exchange or the transactions of liberation. And I just can't help making that link, that I think there are some incredibly obvious links to some breakthrough thinking that was rejected and is now even boxed as a kind of belonging to a particular era. You know, Freire was a very 90s or 80s thinker. And in fact, it's just people's inability to hold the reimagined worldview that he had developed, which involved people being fully present and mindful in every engagement with each other. So I'm very excited about, and Mampela's own history of impacting a whole country's consciousness by simply having difficult conversations and putting a different narrative into the discourse. So I'm very excited about it and looking for multiple connections, which I think we'll find quite easily without diluting anything that you've presented.
Thank you so much, John. Just to respond by saying there was a great deal of inspiration that I felt coming from Mampela's talk and her reference to the LEAP schools as well. So I completely agree that there are linkages to be further explored there, and that we are standing on the shoulders of giants, that we should never forget that. And that a lot of times the disappearance of that thought and that way of thinking has been deliberate. It has been suppressed. So how do we resurface it? And I feel also that one of the advantages of doing it now, and it's a strange thing to say, yeah, I'll say it. One of the advantages of doing it now is that the suffering is so profound because of COVID and the collapse of our systems that people who would have ignored this way of thinking before now are open to it because it's affecting them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Herbie.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak really on behalf of both Carlos and myself about how this work that you are doing, which is so vitally important, could be integrated much more directly into the work of the Club of Rome. And obviously you already referred to the hubs, but you know, are you actually working on a book that we could present as a report to the Club of Rome? Is that something that we can discuss with you?
Thank you, Herbie. Very humbled by that. I would be happy to think about putting some of this into writing. Actually trying to write a chapter now, summarizing some of these thoughts and experiences. And it would be a delight to try to weave that into a Club of Rome report, if that were the format that it should take. Yeah, thank you.
Beautiful. Ted, and then Carlos.
Yeah, each of us is captive of our own culture and in living in our own silo. And I think that we have been each of us have identified the limits in other people's silos, whether they happen to be on Wall Street or whether they happen to be in a particular religious one. One of the biggest challenges I think we all have, and Julia, I think that was a wonderful way to show people that there's much beyond the edges of the silo, is the challenge of how to get people actually to look over the edge and see how many other opportunities there are. And every culture can, I think, be urged to broaden. The real challenge, and I think we'll have to run into this with this one, how are we going to get them to actually listen?
Yeah, thank you, Ted. Thanks for raising that. I mean, I won't even try to answer it because it's such a deep question.
Well, I didn't ask it because it was easy.
But just to say that, you know, the way that we are trying to hold space in this session and this conversation, even using this ridiculous thing called Zoom technology, where we were staring at a laptop in our own respective rooms, that there is a way to create a way of dissolving boundaries and of vulnerability. I think that's a really important word that can be brought into, not just, you think about that when you're talking about meeting with a community in a village in Africa, for example, but we need to bring that kind of vulnerability and listening circles into the spaces of business and the UN and other places as well. It is that feeling of being able to do that. And how do we bring together the conveners, the people who have the skills and the credibility to do that? And I think there are more and more people like that. For example, people like Charles, as David was describing him, who hold that space.
Thank you.
I'd just like to comment, build on that, Julia, and say on Monday I was fortunate enough to be part of the Peace Studio gathering that brought together Nelson Mandela's Nelson Mandela's grandson, Martin Luther King's daughter, and Mahatma Gandhi's grandson. These descendants of these extraordinary leaders had never been together before, and here we were with a group of us in conversation with them. The likelihood of that happening physically, extremely low, but the impacts of it and the depth of listening space that was created in Zoom with those three descendants of great leaders was extraordinary. The possibilities for those spaces and with different people is really quite something. Carlos.
So many thanks, Julia, for your presentation. I would like to come back to the point I made before about the importance of culture. And culture, most of it is implicit. Culture is what we know and we don't know we know it. What we perceive without realizing consciously that we perceive it. And most of our intelligence, most of our capacities are mobilized in that way. When we talk about flow, being in flow, it's not only, as you say very well, being present, it's mobilizing all our capacities. And I would like to say that your presentation is, I enjoyed it particularly because of what you said, yes, to a large extent, but especially the way you said it. So the tone and the selection of, and the aesthetics and the warmth is especially relevant because it's actually the most important part of the message. You know, I'm not saying that you could have said anything else with the same tone and I would have loved it, no, but I particularly appreciated that consistency between the tone and the warmth. Because yes, it is about what we have to do, I think, is to create those spaces for these kind of conversations to take place. And because, so I could discuss about the perspective of Otto Scharmer and you know, there are others, and Nora Bateson is developing a different type of program, and my take is that we have to be careful about being too explicit about how we formulate transformations. It's more about, I think it's more about how do we create the right conditions for people to learn and act by themselves, you know, because everybody is capable of doing that. So it's about creating these spaces, and you have done that today very well. And last comment is that I particularly appreciated your push for hot data in the sense of cultivating, I took note, cultivating the capacity for awareness of relational processes. So please go on with that. Count on me if I can be of any help for that work, because I think this is essential. And of course, it connects well with part of what I said in my own speech about the critical importance of reframing measurements to be aware of relational processes And as Herbie said, I mean, you have here two members of the executive committee saying to you, you have to write a report to the Club of Rome. So please go ahead. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you, Carlos. Maybe just to say, I'm also feeling your warmth and your generosity of heart as you're sharing those words. It really touches me. You know, I start my presentation with my own story because to me, the well-being economy doesn't make sense except how it's been a journey of my own, which involved a lot of letting go and of not knowing as well, and allowing myself to be shaped by new experiences, including Bhutan and South Africa. And in some way, it's what we're trying to cultivate in the programs that we're doing, like the Right Livelihood program, because the idea of a well-being economy and new measures seems so cold and abstract to people. Who wants to change their life for something like that? But when they start to do something like the 9 domains activity we did in a group and reflect on what the economy is, what is its purpose? What is it really? Who creates it? These questions start to come up, and a deep longing to be part of a well-being economy and to start with my own life and my community. And this comes back to something that David mentions in his paper, that the importance of these becoming, starting from the localized, that it's really about how we structure our economies, how we build our own lives together within the local. And that happens only when people's hearts are touched. It doesn't come through an academic theory or a paper. So thank you very much for your warm connection coming all the way over the screen.
Julia, you offer a question, and I'll go to Anitra in just a minute. You know, what is it that we individually and maybe collectively, even in a group, need to let go to create that space? I appreciated and I've always appreciated your personal story of the things that you let go of. Could have been a career as a doctor in Canada, but letting go to pursue each of those steps. Beautiful. Anitra, and I'm going to suggest Anitra will be the last question or comment, and then David can ask you to share a few reflections, and then Julie and I have a particular close we would like to invite us all into that's very much in keeping with some of what's just been shared. Anitra.
Thank you so much, Julia, for a magnificent presentation, and to Charles for all his great facilitation and help. I'm very happy and very honored that you would grace our voyage with this, but I'm particularly interested in this generative listening, which of course is what we want to try to do here. And I can see that it's a very, very different kind of thing. And as you say, you sort of levitate and watch the kind of thoughts that bubble up and then try to put them together. I can remember being in a very difficult space with Christo, the artist, who was coming to Miami to wrap the islands. And the bay, of course, was very fragile and had a lot of, so I could see that all these people were talking to him, and he was an artist and nothing was getting through. So I got up and I went over to the map and I said, well, these islands would be good, putting big red lines around them. And I said, and they're right in the path of the airport, and there are a lot of causeways where you could see it from, and all these shoreline condominiums, and he began really, so bubbling up. It was a regenerative listening of a different sort, because we were bringing in different voices, the voice of the artist, the eye of the artist, the voice of the environmentalist, the science, the governance. And suddenly he grabbed his wife's cashmere sweater, pink, and said, yes, and I think it's going to be this color here. And he tore it in half. And it was just simply wonderful, because something had just suddenly bubbled up once all the different languages became effective in the space.
You've described it beautifully, Anitra.
We have to learn how to do it here with all these very mental and hopefully spiritual and hopefully committed voyageurs.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Anitra. David, a few reflections from you on what you've heard.
This is a truly extraordinary session, Julia. The main thing that comes to mind is an awful lot of people have to hear what you have just shared, and we need to make sure somehow that is available. It reminds me of a very important lesson of my life that, you know, I spent 30 years, went abroad on a mission to teach what we know in the West about ending poverty so that we could save the people of the third world. I was a slow learner, but at the end of the 30 years, I realized that the major benefit of those 30 years were what I learned, not what I taught. And just my assignment for this session, I find deeply teaching. You know, I'm supposed to summarize what you said and then suggest where do we go from there. You know, what that, I realize what that does to me is that instead of the full immersion in what you're listening to, what you're saying, I keep pulling back and making my notes. What the hell am I going to say at the end here that's going to be intelligent and worthy of that role? In a sense, it's, you know, it is so basic to what we are normally expect of ourselves and what we normally expect to do. And this point about generative listening is so important. And this has been such an experience to just immerse yourself in it. I mean, what you provided us was an extraordinary overview connecting the deepest lessons of traditional and indigenous experience, along with the findings at the leading edge of science. It's exactly where we need to go. And I guess in terms of any further comment about where we need to go is we need a lot more of that experience. And in a sense, recognizing both our own individual limitations, but also our contributions as members of a much larger process, of a much larger community, and melding into this deeper, ever deeper understanding of what is the nature of life and what is our human role within that. And that it's, you know, it's not that creation was created for us, but we're created for creation. And the depth of the inner and outer transformation and our increasing ability to join them together is essentially the key to it. And just thank you so much for what you're doing. You have contributed so much to this conversation, and together we go forward.
Yeah, David, I just to second that completely. We always have thought of this as building blocks or synergies, bringing people together, because too often people have just come and told us what they last wrote, rather than telling us what they thought we each needed to talk about. I think, Julia, you were by far best possible choice for a person for right now to get this thing going in the direction that we've been trying to get it to go. We don't really know where it's going. We're narrowing in on a goal that perhaps we all will share. By and large, remember that this started because we didn't like what was happening, rather than having something that said what should be happening and or could be happening. And I think we're still on that path. We are looking at trying to get Kate Raworth in as a speaker, as one of the next people in the building blocks. And each of the people on the screen right now, we view you as a resource at some point in this process. And Anitra and I have been arguing to some extent over who comes next and so on. And we'd like to probably negotiate with each of you over the next few weeks to see what would suit you best and where, how you would best like to make a contribution and when. So that said, thank you ever so much. We asked you because we knew that you would talk to each other and build off what each other said. And this is exactly as Julia has suggested, a building experience where we actually advance each other. So thank you again, and I'll turn it back to Charles because he has some other observations that will probably help us.
I'm going to just briefly share a poem of sorts that I wrote while you were all just speaking in this last 10 minutes. And afterwards, would like to invite you each to write into the chat so you can be thinking about this. What is a reflection that you have, something that was evoked for you personally that you would like to share with this group, and or something that was evoked around possible next steps for this group? So invite you to write that into the chat because we won't have time to hear from each person. These are some of the words I heard in the last 10 minutes. Beautifully reimagining, fully present and mindful in the presence of each other. Resurfacing thought and practice that has been repressed. Now open, potential for integration. Capacities of our own culture, living in our own silos, seeing the limits of these, so much beyond and between the edges of those silos, listening deeply together, created for creation. So I'm just going to take a moment and if you could, in the chat, share your reflections.
I already did.
And you did, Carlos. It was beautiful. The sailing is required, living is not. It's beautiful. Thank you. Anitra, thank you. The inner journey, so much influence. Yes. I recall one corporate client, Bill O'Brien, who is quite well known. He's passed away now. His words were, "The quality of any intervention in a system is a direct reflection of the internal condition of the intervenor."
Mm. Mm-hmm.
If my internal condition is one of uncertainty, fear, scarcity, the impact of my external actions will be far different. I can tell that from both the words that you've shared, the smiles, the energy that's present here, that you've been touched by Julia's gift of her story and recounting of her own experience. And she has one other very, very special gift that I hope she will now share with us by way of closing. Julia, do you think I should read the other poem before? Yeah. We both felt we should maybe bring in someone who is no stranger to the Club of Rome, and her words, the words of this poem acknowledging her. Carlos, come back to your words of earlier about the journey. We're making the road by walking, and this is a poem written in remembrance of a very, very dear and special person, Dana Meadows. I'm going to read this and then invite Julia to close us with something very special. One day you open your eyes and realize that it is other people who make us. This is especially true for people like us, people who want to improve the world, who offer themselves in service of the world. We bring certain abilities, preferences, passions. Then the world, disguised as our friends and mentors, students and colleagues, decides what we are to be.
Super. Mm-hmm.
Julia?
So one of the things that happened when I was living in South Africa was my classically trained violinist self met with an electric violin, and I toured for a while with a band in South Africa, and I unlearned my classical training and learned how to improvise. And this has been my teacher for generative listening. So I'm going to close with just some sound that I'm feeling, and I don't know what I'm going to play, so it's a little bit scary. All I can say that it's going to be resonating what I felt from all of you and our session. And as I play, because our mindsets and our vision is so important, I would like to invite all of you to bring to mind this future that we are collectively envisioning, and whatever images or feelings that are the beginning of the seeds of that future.
Bravo. The song of the voyageurs.
Great.
Well, folks, that was special. And we must do it again.
We're very, very happy to have had the two of you spend this time and space with us.
Mhm.
You put the bar very high for whoever will come later.
And we need all of you to collude with us to make sure we get people approaching the standard for the next ones.
Perhaps dancing elephants or tigers.
I'll lend you my dog.
Thank you, Charles, also for your presence and your holding of this. And
Sure.
I hope one of the discussions we might have is how to bring you more and more involved in convenings like this.
Yeah, we think that this will be, in a sense, the start of making it larger, but we're on the right path now, and we want to make sure we keep that way. We'll enlarge it as soon as it's useful to do so. And once again, you are the group. We're not making anything happen. We're trying to let you people work with us to make it whole for all of us.
And Steve. Thank
Yeah.
you so much, Charles. Thank you so much, Julia. We're honored and we're extremely happy that you could be with us.
And thank you, Anitra, for all your work in facilitating this and making it happen.
You're welcome, John. John was a colleague and very close writer with Dana Meadows for many years and wrote many
Wow.
books and projects. Yes.
Journey well, journey safely, everybody.
Thank you so much. I'm absolutely inspired with new hope. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Go
Very
well.
well done.
Take much care.